Hello everyone, welcome to the QuesterMage, a mage's quest to talk about games. That's what we like to do here, talk about games. If that's what you like, please consider clicking the like, subscribe, and notification bell for more of our content in the future. Thank you very much. In today's video, I want to talk about the Hori Real Arcade Pro 5, or Wrap 5 HAYABUSA arcade stick, the official Nintendo licensed product which is not compatible with button mapping on the Nintendo Switch. I've owned one of these arcade sticks for quite a while now, and overall I really like it. First, let's take a look at the stats and features of this arcade stick. So this arcade stick has a height of 4.9 inches, that's including the stick and lever, a length of 17 inches, depth of 9.5 inches, it weighs 4.8 pounds, and the cable length is 9.8 foot or 3 meters. Please note that this is a wired only controller. Features wise, this arcade stick comes with a sturdy build, a good weight to it, a good quality stick and buttons. Please note that the stick and buttons are both the HAYABUSA brand and that the stick itself, or the lever, is a 4-way or square gate stick. It comes with turbo mode, assign mode, more on this later, X input and Nintendo Switch mode, the ability for the stick or lever to be changed between the left stick, right stick or the D-pad on the Switch. And the buttons include the left and right stick buttons, the ones when you click in the analog sticks themselves. Now I bought this arcade stick as I wanted to play mainly retro games with an arcade controller. I wanted a good quality arcade stick too. At the time I was torn between two options, the Hori Wrap 5 HAYABUSA arcade stick, or the 8BitDo Bluetooth arcade stick at the time, which I'll put up on screen now. The Hori one being the more expensive but officially licensed, and the 8BitDo being the more versatile out of the two. I eventually bought the Hori Wrap 5 because of it being the official Nintendo licensed product, as I mentioned before. I thought that in the future, if there was to be an issue, this could be fixed via an update by the console manufacturer or the developer themselves. I also thought that if there were any features to be added, this arcade stick would be compatible. Again, as it's officially licensed, I thought that if there were any features to be added later on, this arcade stick would be at the top of the line. Unfortunately, it was not. I really liked the arcade stick, but noticed that there was no real way to remap the buttons. So for games like the Sega Mega Drive Classics, I wanted to remap the buttons to match the Mega Drive pad. You know, the ABC XYZ layout or the arcade layout itself. For instance, if I wanted to play a 6-button controller game, I would want the ABC XYZ layout. B would be A would be B, ZR would be C, Y would be X, X would be Y, and R would be Z. If I wanted to play with an arcade layout, depending on the arcade, you look it up online and then you could mimic that layout on the arcade stick itself. But as I mentioned, there was no real way to do this. The game itself also doesn't give the player the option to remap buttons, which is always a weird choice not to put this in your game, at least in my opinion. Developers should always give us accessibility options. The more accessible the game is to players, the more players that will buy your game. You could use the assign mode, you say. Well, let's take a look at that, shall we? So, the assign mode itself has two settings. The X input, which allows you to remap buttons for the computer apparently, and the Nintendo Switch version, which you can only remap the L and ZL buttons on the official Nintendo licensed product, which is specifically made for the Switch. I don't know why, but that's just the way it was made. So let's fast forward a little bit from then. The 10.0 update came out for Nintendo Switch, which was great because it launched and we finally had the ability to button map our controllers. I thought this was a solution to the button mapping issue. I loaded up the Mega Drive Classics and unfortunately it didn't work. So here's where the idea for this video started. When the update was first launched, I updated the system and grabbed two controllers at the time. The Hori HAYABUSA arcade stick and the 8BitDo M30 controller, which at the time I wasn't too happy with because I couldn't remap the buttons to play the Mega Drive Classics, which is why I bought the controller in the first place. I launched the game and remapped the 8BitDo controller, and suddenly a controller which at the time, like I said, I wasn't a big fan of, suddenly became one of my favourite controllers, until this day. So far the button remapping was win-win in my opinion. So when I tried to map my Hori HAYABUSA arcade stick, well, from the home menu I clicked on the options, went to controls and sensors, change button mapping, just like before, but this time, this is what the option showed me. As you can see here, I had a pair of Joy-Con and the Hori arcade stick plugged in at the time, but the arcade stick said, cannot be changed. And also here on the side, as you can see, it said, button mapping cannot be changed for this controller. At this point in time, I thought, why? I thought I was doing something wrong, so I checked the manual and checked online. There's no real help for this issue, at least that I could find. I changed the mode from Nintendo Switch to X input and nothing worked. I just couldn't remap the buttons. This is where confusion and frustration obviously started to set in. I have an 8BitDo third-party controller which I can button remap natively on the Nintendo Switch itself, but I have an official licensed arcade stick which I cannot. So let's look at what I think the issues are with this controller. Sensitive button activation. Not necessarily a bad thing, but some users might not like this, so I thought I'd mention it. I don't mind it myself, even though sometimes I do accidentally press on the buttons, but it doesn't happen often enough for me not to like it. Some buttons being on the side. It's a slight issue. As you can see here, it's on this side of the arcade stick. And then here on the side of the box you can see the buttons are right there. We have the stick, mode, turbo, and assign switches, followed by the turbo button, the minus, left stick, right stick, capture, and home buttons. So when using the arcade stick, more often than not I want to press one of these buttons on the side. I find myself having to lift the controller itself to see where the buttons are. Even though there are labels on the face of the arcade stick itself, they're just kinda hard to read. Button remapping. Obviously, this is the biggest issue for me as I'm dedicating a whole video to it. I really don't think this should be a problem that customers should be having with these arcade sticks. So moving on to the improvements. Side buttons being moved to the top. So all the buttons on the side could have been moved to the top, but I don't think all of them have to be, at least the ones we might use the most. So for me, personally, it would be the minus button being moved to the top, and maybe the left and right stick buttons. Because when you're halfway through a game and you want to press one of these buttons, you don't really want to be lifting the arcade stick itself to find out where they are. Especially as the minus button in some games is actually the pause button. Bluetooth connectivity. I know this isn't a preferred method for some players with an arcade stick, but I'm a firm believer of the more options, the better for the consumers. I would think that Bluetooth is generally easier and more convenient for most people. Some players I know don't like to actually have a cable stretching from their console all the way to their sofa, for example. So Bluetooth would eliminate that. Internal battery. Hand in hand with Bluetooth, this would be great for versatility as you can just carry it wherever you like. If it would have Bluetooth, I think it would need an internal battery. Hardware button remapping. If there's an assign mode, it should allow the user to remap any button on the arcade stick. I understand certain limitations to the maybe plus, minus, capture and home buttons, but all the other buttons I think at least should be remappable. I think the issues could and maybe should be fixed by several entities. Number one, the game developers themselves, who for some reason don't want to add button mapping to their games, which is again weird. Number two, the accessory developers themselves. I think more options are always better. Weird not having a button remapping or program button on an arcade stick. Number three, the console manufacturer, which only allows customers to remap buttons on only specific controllers. Not a big fan of this. Currently, the button remapping works for the following controllers, which I've tested or at least have been told work. So the Joy-Con work, I've tried it myself. The Pro controllers I'm told works, but I don't actually have one. And the 8BitDo M30 Bluetooth controller. Right now, you probably think I don't like the arcade stick. But as I said earlier, I actually do. Very much so. I use it all the time for many games. Most of them have button remapping in the game, or I just figured out a weird way of button remapping and play it anyway. But I always think, why is this a problem? If a third-party controller has features natively on the console, surely an official licensed product should also. Possible fixes? I think the way to fix this is to allow button remapping on the controllers themselves in the future. This way, the player can always change the layout to fit their needs. But for this specific issue with the Hori Rap 5 Hayabusa arcade stick, maybe an update or a patch for the arcade stick itself. Alternatively, to include this in a future update for the Nintendo Switch itself. This way, an official controller could have a native way on the console itself to change the button mapping available. So what do you all think of an officially Nintendo licensed controller not having button remapping? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? How would you change it? Please leave your impression down in the comment section. But that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you very much again for clicking on this video and for visiting the channel. If you do like what we do here, please click like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more of our content in the future. Really helps out the channel. It's the only way we can deliver more content in the future. And until then, thanks again.